The most powerful person in the room is rarely the one talking the most. It's the one who speaks last and says the least. Because when words are chosen carefully, they land harder and stay longer. We grow up believing that speaking more means being smarter, more confident, more convincing. It's almost like an unspoken rule. The person who talks the most must know the most. The person who has an answer for everything must be strong. The person who can fill any silence must be confident. So from a young age you learn to talk. In school you're praised for raising your hand. You're rewarded for having something to say. You're told to participate and express yourself. And that's not a bad thing, being able to speak matters. But slowly something else gets attached to it. You start believing that if you don't speak quickly you'll look slow. If you don't explain fully you'll look weak. If you don't defend yourself you'll look guilty. If you don't fill silence you'll look awkward. So you become someone who keeps talking. Not always because you have more to say, sometimes because you're scared of what silence might imply. Silence feels awkward. Silence feels like weakness. It feels like that moment in a conversation when everyone pauses, and you can almost hear your heartbeat. You start wondering what the other person is thinking. You start imagining judgment. You start feeling exposed. So you talk. You add another sentence. Then another. Then another. And you tell yourself you're just being clear. But deep down, you know you're also trying to protect yourself. We're taught to explain ourselves fully. You know what that looks like. Someone asks you a simple question, and instead of answering simply, you give a full backstory. You give reasons, context, justifications. You try to cover every angle so nobody misunderstands you. You try to say everything because you're afraid one missing detail will make you look wrong. You're taught to defend your ideas quickly. If someone challenges you even slightly, you feel pressure to respond immediately. The moment you hear a different opinion, your mind starts building a counter-argument. You stop listening. You start preparing. Because in your head, a conversation becomes a competition. You're taught to fill every silence with words. Silence becomes an emergency. Like something must be fixed right now. Like if you don't speak, you'll lose attention. Or lose control. Or lose respect. So you talk. We over-explain. We justify. We repeat ourselves. We rush to respond. And without realizing it, we dilute our message. That's the part that hurts when you finally notice it. Because your intention was good. You weren't trying to be annoying or confusing. You were trying to be understood. You were trying to sound competent. You were trying to protect your position. But the more you speak from fear, the less impact your words have. It's like pouring water into a cup that's already full. Instead of helping, it spills everywhere. You've probably seen it happen. Maybe at work. Maybe in a meeting. Maybe in a group conversation. Someone has a good point, but they keep talking. You can almost see it. They start strong. Their first sentence is clear. People look up. The room listens. But then they keep going. They add details no one asked for. They include unnecessary examples. They circle back and repeat the same idea in different words. They start defending themselves before anyone even challenges them, like they're arguing with an invisible critic. You can sense the shift in the room. At first people are engaged. Then they start glancing away. Someone checks their phone. Someone else interrupts gently. The energy changes. Not because the person was wrong, but because the point got buried under too many words. By the time they finish, the room has moved on. And the saddest part is, the speaker often doesn't realize what happened. They walk away thinking, I explained it so well. Why didn't it land? Or they blame the room. People don't listen. People don't care. But the truth is simpler. People did listen, until the message got lost. This happens in relationships too. You try to express something important. Something emotional. Something that matters to you. But you say too much because you're nervous. You add old examples. You bring up the past. You start explaining every detail of how you feel, why you feel it, what they did, what they said, what you meant, what you didn't mean. And at some point the other person stops hearing your heart. They only hear noise. They get overwhelmed, defensive, confused. They don't know what to respond to because you've given them 10 different points in one breath. So they shut down. Or they pick one small part to argue about. Or they walk away. And you're left feeling misunderstood again. Which makes you talk even more next time. That's how the cycle continues. It's not that you have too many words. It's that you're using words to do a job they can't do. Words can't control how people see you. Words can't remove all misunderstanding. Words can't guarantee respect. When you over-explain, you're trying to make your message safe. You're trying to make sure nobody questions you. You're trying to avoid conflict, avoid judgment, avoid awkwardness. But over-explaining doesn't create safety. It often creates doubt. Because the more you justify, the more it sounds like you're unsure. The more you defend, the more it sounds like you're being attacked. The more you talk, the less weight each sentence carries. And slowly you start noticing something. Power doesn't come from volume. It comes from precision. Precision is a different kind of confidence. Precision is saying one clear sentence and letting it sit. Precision is making your point and stopping. Precision is trusting that you don't need 10 extra explanations to be respected. Precision doesn't mean being cold. It doesn't mean being silent all the time. It means your words have intention. It means you speak because you have something to say, not because you're uncomfortable with silence. And the shift toward precision often begins with one painful moment. Maybe you remember a time you talked too much and regretted it. A time you tried to explain yourself and ended up sounding guilty. A time you tried to prove your point and the conversation turned messy. Or maybe you remember the opposite. A time someone spoke very little and it hit you hard. You felt that too. Someone looks at you and says, "I hear you," and stops. Or someone says, "That doesn't work for me," and stops. No anger. No extra words. No long explanation. And for some reason, those short sentences carry more weight than a 5-minute speech. Because they are clean. They are confident. They are not trying to convince you, they are simply true. That's what precision does. It communicates certainty without force. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of us don't speak too much because we have too much to say. We speak too much because we don't feel secure. We're trying to earn our place in the conversation. Earn respect. Earn approval. Earn certainty. And we try to earn it with words. But confidence isn't earned by talking. Confidence is earned by trusting yourself enough to stop. That's a hard practice. It means letting silence exist without panicking. It means letting someone disagree without rushing to defend. It means allowing your message to land without chasing it. It's uncomfortable at first because you feel exposed. When you say less, you feel like you're leaving space for someone to judge you. Space for them to misunderstand you. Space for them to challenge you. But that space is also where your power lives. Because when you stop over-explaining, you stop begging to be understood. You start communicating with calm. And calm is persuasive. Calm says, "I know what I mean." Calm says, "I don't need to argue." Calm says, "I'm not here to perform." And people feel that. They feel it in your tone. In your posture. In your pace. They listen differently to someone who isn't desperate to be heard. They respect someone who doesn't scramble for approval. So the next time you feel yourself rushing to respond, pause. Notice the urge. Notice how your body feels when silence shows up. Notice the little anxiety that whispers, "Say something. Explain more. Don't let it get awkward." And then do something simple. Breathe. Ask yourself, what is my main point? What is the one sentence that matters? What can I remove without losing meaning? Then say it. And stop. Let it land. It might feel strange. It might feel too short. You might feel like you should add more. But give the moment a chance. Because the truth is, the most powerful communicators aren't the ones who have the most to say. They're the ones who can say the right thing without drowning it. And once you learn that, your words start carrying weight again. Not because you became louder. Because you became precise. Silence makes people uncomfortable. You can feel it the moment it appears. A pause stretches a little longer than expected, and something inside tightens. The mind starts scrambling for words, any words just to fill the gap. People clear their throats. They laugh nervously. They say things they didn't plan to say, not because those words matter, but because silence feels like a problem that needs fixing. That's why most people avoid it. We're taught, subtly and constantly, that silence means awkwardness. That it means you've lost control of the conversation. That it means you don't know what to say. That it makes you look uncertain, unprepared, or weak. So we rush. We talk over each other. We explain too much. We jump in before the other person finishes. We fill every gap with noise and call it communication. But silence is not empty. Silence is space. And space changes everything. Think about how silence actually feels when you let it exist. At first, it's uncomfortable, yes. Your heart rate picks up just slightly. Your thoughts get louder. You become more aware of yourself, of the other person, of the room. But then, if you don't fight it, something else happens. The discomfort settles. The space opens. And inside that space, attention sharpens. When you stop talking, people start listening. Not because you demanded attention. Not because you raised your voice. But because you removed the noise. You gave their mind room to land. In a world where everyone is rushing to be heard, silence feels unexpected. And what's unexpected draws focus. When you pause, people lean in. It's subtle, but it's real. Their posture shifts. Their eyes stay on you a second longer. Their brain starts filling the gap with curiosity. What are they about to say? Why did they stop? The pause creates anticipation, and anticipation gives weight to whatever comes next. When you don't rush to respond, your words gain gravity. They don't feel reactive. They don't feel defensive. They don't feel rushed. They feel chosen. Most people don't realize how much they dilute their own message by speaking too quickly. They answer before they've fully heard the question. They respond to the emotion instead of the meaning. They start talking while their thoughts are still forming, and the listener can feel it. The message lands scattered. The impact fades. Silence fixes that. Silence forces you to be intentional. And intentional words linger. Think about the moments that stayed with you. Not the long speeches. Not the explanations that went on forever. The moments you remember years later were usually quiet ones. A calm sentence spoken without hurry. A pause before someone said something honest. A look that held meaning because it wasn't buried under words. Those sentences were short, clear, calm. They didn't rush to impress. They didn't try to prove anything. They didn't compete for attention. They arrived fully formed and landed clean. The strongest communicators understand this. And more importantly, they're not afraid of silence. They don't see it as a threat. They use it. They pause before answering even when they know the answer right away. Not because they're unsure, but because they respect the moment. Because they understand that how something is said matters just as much as what is said. That pause signals thoughtfulness. It signals control. It tells the other person, I'm present. I'm considering this. I'm not just reacting. They let conversations breathe. They don't panic when there's a gap. They don't rush to fill every second. They allow space for the other person to think, to feel, to continue. And in doing so, they often get more honesty. People reveal more when they're not being rushed. They explain deeper when silence gives them permission to finish their thoughts. They don't rush to fill gaps. And this is where it gets uncomfortable for most people because gaps feel like exposure. In silence, there's nowhere to hide. You can't cover insecurity with chatter. You can't distract from uncertainty with speed. Silence asks you to stand in yourself without armor. That's why it's powerful. Because in that space, presence grows. When you're comfortable with silence, people feel it. They feel your steadiness. They feel your calm. They sense that you're not anxious to be validated, not desperate to control the moment. And that changes how they experience you. Silence signals confidence. Not the loud, performative kind. Not the kind that demands attention. The quiet kind. The grounded kind. The kind that doesn't need to prove itself. It says, I don't need to fill this moment to feel okay. It says, I trust my words enough to let them stand on their own. It says, I'm not afraid of this space. And that alone changes how people perceive you. You've probably felt this difference without realizing it. Think about someone who spoke slowly, calmly, with pauses. Someone who didn't rush, didn't interrupt, didn't over-explain. Chances are, you took them seriously. You listened more closely. Their words felt heavier, not because they were louder or smarter, but because they weren't competing with noise. Now think about the opposite. Someone who talks nonstop. Who answers before the question finishes. Who fills every silence with nervous explanations. Even if they're intelligent, something feels off. The energy feels scattered. The message feels less trustworthy, not because it's wrong, but because it feels uncentered. Silence is what gives words a frame. Without silence, everything blends together. With silence, meaning separates. This matters in conversations, in meetings, in relationships, in moments of tension. Especially in moments of tension. When emotions are high, most people talk more. They explain. They defend. They justify. They rush to be understood. But that often makes things worse. Words pile up. Tone sharpens. Misunderstandings multiply. Silence used well can de-escalate what words cannot. A pause before responding to criticism can prevent defensiveness. A moment of quiet after someone shares something vulnerable can make them feel truly heard. A calm pause in an argument can shift the entire direction of the conversation. Not because silence fixes everything, but because it creates space for emotion to settle. And settled emotions hear better. This doesn't mean silence is avoidance. It's not about shutting down or withdrawing. There's a difference between intentional silence and fearful silence. Intentional silence is present. It's grounded. It's engaged. Fearful silence is tense, close, disconnected. People can feel the difference. Intentional silence feels like, I'm here with you. Fearful silence feels like, I'm hiding. The strongest communicators know when to speak and when not to. They're not uncomfortable letting the other person sit with a thought. They're not afraid of letting a question hang for a moment. They understand that people often answer more honestly after the pause than they do before it. Because silence invites depth. When you ask a question and stay quiet, the other person often goes further. They think again. They refine. They access something more real. But if you rush to fill the silence, you steal that moment from them. Silence is generous. It gives the other person room to exist. It also gives you room to choose your response instead of being driven by impulse. That space between stimulus and response is where wisdom lives. Silence protects that space. And over time, something interesting happens when you use silence consistently. People begin to associate your presence with calm, with clarity, with weight. They listen more closely not because you demand it but because they've learned that when you speak it matters. Your words don't compete. They land. This is especially powerful in a world that never stops talking. Notifications, opinions, arguments. Everyone trying to be heard all at once. Silence cuts through that noise not by being louder but by being different. It stands out because it doesn't chase attention. And paradoxically, that's why it attracts it. Silence also communicates boundaries without saying a word. It says you're not obligated to respond instantly. It says you're not reactive. It says you're thoughtful. And in professional settings, in leadership, in difficult conversations, that perception carries influence. People trust those who aren't rushed. They trust those who don't speak just to hear themselves talk. They trust those who leave space instead of dominating it. Because silence suggests inner stability. And inner stability is rare. Of course, learning to use silence takes practice. At first, it feels unnatural. You'll feel the urge to jump in. You'll worry about how you're being perceived. You'll wonder if the other person thinks you're awkward or unsure. But most of that fear lives in your head. Most people are too busy processing their own thoughts to judge your pause. And even if they do notice it, what they often perceive isn't weakness. It's presence. It's composure. It's confidence. The kind that doesn't announce itself. Silence teaches you to trust yourself. To trust that you don't need constant motion to have value. To trust that your voice doesn't disappear just because you paused. To trust that you're allowed to take up space without filling it. And once you trust that, your communication changes. You speak less but say more. You listen longer and understand deeper. You respond instead of react. And people feel that difference immediately. In that space, conversations slow down. Meaning deepens. Respect grows. Silence becomes a tool, not a threat. A signal, not an absence. It signals that you're grounded enough to wait. That you're confident enough not to rush. That you're secure enough not to prove yourself right now. And in a world full of noise, that quiet strength is unmistakable. Because silence, when used with intention, doesn't make you invisible. It makes you unforgettable. Most people don't talk too much because they're confident. That's the story we tell ourselves when we're watching someone ramble. We assume they love the sound of their own voice. We assume they're trying to dominate the room. We assume they're arrogant or unaware or desperate for attention. But if you've ever been that person, if you've ever felt your mouth keep moving even when your mind is quietly begging you to stop, you know the real reason has nothing to do with confidence. Most people talk too much because they're afraid. Afraid of being misunderstood. Afraid of being judged. Afraid of losing control of the conversation. It usually starts with a simple sentence. A normal point. A normal opinion. Something you could say in 10 words. You open your mouth, you begin, and then you feel it, that tiny flicker of uncertainty. The moment where you imagine how your words might land. The moment where you picture someone's face tightening, their eyebrows lifting, their tone changing. And suddenly, your brain starts running ahead of you. What if they take it the wrong way? What if they think I'm rude? What if they think I'm stupid? What if they don't understand what I mean? So you keep going. You add context. You add a story. You add a small explanation just to be safe. Then another. Then another. And now you're not just speaking, you're managing risk. You're trying to prevent a misunderstanding before it happens. You're trying to control how the other person sees you. You're trying to build a cushion around your truth so it doesn't hit anyone too hard. You're trying to protect yourself from the discomfort of being misread. So you explain everything. You add disclaimers. You soften your message. You try to cover every angle. You say things like, I'm not saying this in a bad way, or, I don't want you to think I mean it like that, or maybe I'm wrong but... You start trimming your own honesty while you're still speaking it. You water it down in real time. You tell yourself you're just being considerate. You're just being clear. You're just trying to communicate well. But deep down, it's not clarity you're chasing. It's safety. Because there's a specific fear underneath over-explaining. The fear of being judged for who you are. You're not just scared they'll misunderstand your point. You're scared they'll misunderstand you. That they'll label you incorrectly. that they'll assume the worst, that they'll decide something about your character based on one sentence. And if you've ever been misunderstood in a painful way before, if you've ever been accused of something you didn't intend or watched someone twist your words, or felt the sting of being seen as the villain when you were just trying to be honest, you learn a certain kind of caution. You start trying to pre-defend yourself. You start adding protective layers to your words. And the weird part is, it feels responsible. It feels like maturity to explain yourself fully. It feels like prevention. It feels like you're being thoughtful. But then something happens. The more you explain, the more unsure you sound. Not because your point is weak, because your energy is. When you over-explain, it signals that you don't trust your own words to stand on their own. It signals that you're trying to convince the other person that you're not a bad person for saying what you're saying. It signals that you're afraid of how they'll respond. And people feel that. Even if they don't consciously notice it, they sense it. They sense the anxiety behind the clarification. They sense the neediness behind the extra sentences. They sense the hidden request underneath the words, "Please don't judge me." So instead of sounding clear, you start sounding shaky. Instead of sounding thoughtful, you start sounding uncertain. And what's painful is you can feel it happening while it's happening. You can hear yourself talking, adding sentence after sentence, but you don't know how to stop without it feeling abrupt. You feel trapped in your own explanation. You feel like if you pause, the other person might jump in and misunderstand. You feel like you have to keep building the bridge while you're walking across it. It's exhausting. And afterward you replay it. You think, why did I say all that? Why couldn't I just state it simply? Why did I sound like I was defending myself? You feel that quiet embarrassment, like you exposed something you didn't mean to expose. Not just your idea but your insecurity behind it. Then you start noticing something. Strong speakers don't do that. Strong speakers trust their words. They say what needs to be said and stop. Not because they don't care how it lands. Not because they're cold. Not because they enjoy being misunderstood. They stop because they trust themselves. They trust that their words are enough. They trust that if someone has a question, they'll ask. They trust that if someone misunderstands, it can be clarified without panic. They trust that they don't need to overwork every sentence to be seen as a good person. There's a calmness to that. A steadiness. It's not loud confidence. It's not showy. It's not that performative, "I don't care what anyone thinks" attitude. It's something deeper. It's the confidence of someone who knows who they are. So they don't chase validation through constant clarification. They don't rush to cover every possible misunderstanding before it happens. They allow others to process. This part is so underrated. Allowing silence. Allowing space. Allowing the other person to sit with what you said for a moment without you rushing in to fill the gap with more words. Most people can't do that because silence feels dangerous. Silence feels like rejection. Silence feels like, "Oh, I said it wrong." So they talk more. They fill the silence with more explanation, more softness, more backup arguments, more reassurance. But strong speakers don't flinch at silence. They understand that silence doesn't always mean disapproval. Sometimes it means the other person is thinking. Sometimes it means they're processing. Sometimes it means your words actually landed, and it takes a moment for someone to respond honestly. Silence can be a sign of respect. It can be a sign that your words mattered. And when you can sit in that silence without scrambling, you communicate something powerful without saying anything. You communicate, "I trust what I said." And that trust changes how people respond to you. Because when you speak simply and stop, your words have weight. They sit in the air longer. They don't get buried under extra explanation. They don't get diluted by disclaimers. They stand. And people feel that. They feel the firmness. They feel the clarity. They feel that you're not begging to be understood, you're offering your truth calmly and letting them meet it. That's persuasive. That's grounded. That's strong. But here's what most people miss. Speaking less doesn't mean saying less truth. It means saying the truth cleaner. It means removing the fear that clings to your sentences. It means not trying to control the other person's reaction. Because that's the root of over-explaining if you really look at it. It's control. Not control in a manipulative way, but control as a coping mechanism. If you can explain perfectly, maybe you can prevent being judged. If you can cover every angle, maybe no one can criticize you. If you can soften it enough, maybe no one will be upset. If you can clarify everything, maybe you won't be misunderstood. But you can't control how people interpret you. You can only control how clearly you show up. And strong speakers accept that. They accept the risk of being misunderstood. Not because they like it, but because they've learned that constantly protecting yourself through words makes you smaller. It makes you tired. It makes you sound unsure even when you're not. So instead they practice something else. They practice stating what they mean. They practice breathing after they speak. They practice letting their words land. They practice trusting the conversation. And that's not easy at first. Because if you're used to over-explaining, saying less feels like stepping off a ledge. It feels like you're leaving yourself exposed. It feels like you're giving up your armor. You might even feel guilty. Like you're being too blunt. Like you're being selfish. Like you're not being considerate enough. But that guilt often comes from a lifetime of trying to be understood by overperforming your communication. It comes from the habit of making your message responsible for other people's feelings. Strong speakers don't do that. They still care. They still choose their words thoughtfully. They still try to be respectful. But they don't carry the entire emotional burden of the conversation on their back. They don't try to say everything at once. They say what needs to be said. And they let it breathe. And when someone asks a question, they answer it. When someone misunderstands, they clarify, once, calmly. Not desperately. Not excessively. They don't keep adding more and more until they've talked themselves out of their own point. They don't keep shrinking their message to avoid discomfort. They trust the truth enough to let it stand. And that's what changes you too. Because when you say less, you show trust in yourself. You show that you believe your words have value. You show that you don't need to beg for understanding. You show that you can handle someone's reaction without trying to manage it in advance. You show that you're not afraid of being seen. And when you're not afraid of being seen, your voice changes. It becomes steadier, cleaner, more direct. You stop speaking like you're asking permission. You start speaking like you belong in the conversation. You don't rush to apologize for existing. You don't coat your truth in nervous laughter. You don't add 10 extra sentences to prove you're a good person. You become simple. And simplicity is powerful. Because clarity is power. Not the kind that dominates. The kind that stands. The kind that doesn't wobble when the room gets quiet. The kind that trusts itself enough to stop talking. And in that moment, when you finally say what you mean and you let the silence come, and you don't chase the other person's approval, you realize something. The fear was never about the message. The fear was about trusting yourself. And the day you learn to speak without fear's extra words, you don't just become a better communicator. You become a stronger person. The human brain remembers clarity, not clutter. You can feel that in real life if you pay attention. Think about the last time someone explained something to you and you walked away feeling heavy. Not because the topic was complicated, but because the way they said it was. Their words kept piling up, looping back on themselves, adding extra details, extra justifications, extra side stories. By the time they finished, you weren't even sure what the point was anymore. You just knew you were tired. And then think about the opposite. The moments that stick. A simple sentence that landed like it had weight. A short line that stayed in your head for days. A phrase you found yourself repeating to someone else without even trying. That's not an accident. That's how we're built. Our brains don't hold on to clutter. They don't reward noise. They hold on to what's clear. What's clean. What feels like it has a center. Short sentences are easier to understand. Easier to remember. Easier to repeat. And repetition is power. Because what gets repeated spreads. What gets repeated becomes culture. What gets repeated becomes belief. That's why the most impactful statements in history are simple. Not because the people who said them had nothing more to add, but because they knew something most people forget. The mind can only carry so much. A sentence that's too long becomes work. A message that's too packed becomes a puzzle. And most people don't have the time, energy, or emotional space to solve puzzles in everyday conversation. They don't want to decode you. They want to understand you. That's why speaking with fewer words makes your message sharper. It doesn't wander. It doesn't confuse. It doesn't invite unnecessary debate. Because wandering words create wandering thoughts. If you don't know where you're going, the other person can't follow. And even if they're trying, they'll start filling in the gaps with assumptions. They'll latch onto the wrong detail. They'll get stuck on a side point you never meant to emphasize. Then suddenly the conversation is about something you didn't even mean. And now you're explaining your explanation. Now you're defending a sentence you didn't need to say in the first place. Now you're trapped in the messy middle of too many words. You've probably experienced that moment where you hear yourself talking and you can feel the point slipping away. You start strong, but then you add a disclaimer. Then another. Then you try to soften it. Then you try to make sure they don't misunderstand you. Then you add examples and backstory and context and jokes and extra details just to keep the vibe safe. And halfway through, a quiet voice inside you says, "What am I even trying to say?" But you keep going because silence feels risky. So you talk. A lot of people do. Not because they have more meaning, but because they have more fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being judged. Fear of saying it wrong. Fear of not sounding smart enough. Fear of not being liked. So they fill the space with words like padding. And the strange thing is, the more you pad, the less powerful you become. The more you explain, the more you invite confusion. The more you justify, the more you make it sound like you don't believe yourself. Saying less forces you to be intentional. It forces you to look at your message and ask, what is the real point here? Because most of what people say isn't necessary. It's emotional noise. It's hesitation. It's overthinking out loud. It's trying to cover every possible misunderstanding before it happens. But clarity doesn't come from covering everything. Clarity comes from choosing what matters. And that takes discipline. It's actually harder to say something in 10 words than it is to say it in 100. 100 words gives you room to hide. You can wander. You can blur the edges. You can toss in extra thoughts until something lands. But 10 words? 10 words makes you face your own thinking. You have to decide what you believe. You have to choose a direction. You have to commit to a point. And commitment is what gives words their weight. That's why saying less forces you to ask yourself, what actually matters here? This question feels simple, but it's uncomfortable because it makes you confront how often you speak out of impulse instead of intention. It makes you realize that sometimes you're not talking to communicate, you're talking to release tension. You're talking to prove you're right. You're talking to make sure the other person sees you a certain way. But when you ask what actually matters here, you shift from emotion to purpose. You start filtering. You start trimming. You start removing the parts that are just you trying to protect your ego. Then comes the next question. What is the core message? The core message is the sentence you'd say if you had only one breath. It's the center of what you mean. The truth without the decoration. And most people don't know their core message because they've never paused long enough to find it. They speak in circles around it. They gesture toward it. They hope the other person will catch it. But the best communicators don't hope. They deliver. They know exactly what they're saying and why. Then comes the final question that separates a good speaker from a powerful one. What can be removed without losing meaning? This is where the discipline lives. Because when you start removing words, you start noticing what was never really needed. You start noticing how many sentences are just repeats, just softer versions of the same point, just explanations you added because you were scared the first version was too direct. And directness is what most people avoid. Not because they don't know what they want to say, but because directness feels vulnerable. Directness says this is what I mean. Directness says this is what I need. Directness says this is what I'm not okay with. And when you say it clearly, you can't hide behind ambiguity. You can't pretend you didn't mean it. You can't backtrack without admitting it. So people choose clutter instead. They choose long sentences. They choose kind of, and maybe, and I don't know, and it's not a big deal, but they choose the messy safety of saying everything so that they can later claim they said nothing. But clarity doesn't allow you that escape. Clarity makes you responsible for your words. That's why so many people stay noisy. Noise feels safer. Noise gives you room to move. But noise doesn't build trust. Clarity does. When you speak with fewer words, your message becomes sharper. It becomes easier for the other person to hold. It becomes easier for them to repeat. And if they can repeat it, they can act on it. They can share it. They can remember it under stress. That's another piece most people ignore. Stress steals attention. When someone is overwhelmed, they can't absorb long explanations. Their mind is already crowded. Their body is already tense. If you add more clutter, you don't help. You drown them. But clarity cuts through stress. A simple sentence can land even in chaos. That's why clarity isn't just a communication style. It's a gift. It respects people's time. It respects their focus. It respects their emotional capacity. It says, I'm not going to make you work to understand me. And that's rare. This discipline separates powerful speakers from noisy ones. Because noisy speakers use words to fill space. Powerful speakers use words to create impact. Noisy speakers talk until something sticks. Powerful speakers choose what sticks before they speak. Noisy speakers chase reactions. Powerful speakers deliver meaning. And you can feel the difference immediately when you're around someone like that. They don't ramble. They don't over-explain. They don't throw 10 sentences at you hoping one lands. They say one clean thing. And then they stop. That stopping is part of the power. Because silence after clarity creates weight. It gives the message room to settle. It tells the other person this matters enough to stand on its own. Most people don't trust their message enough to let it stand. They keep talking because they're afraid the point won't be taken seriously. They keep adding layers because they're afraid of being challenged. But the stronger you are in your message, the less you need to decorate it. And the truth is, this isn't just about sounding confident. It's about thinking clearly. Because you can't speak clearly if you don't think clearly. And you can't think clearly if you're afraid to decide what matters. Clarity is a decision. It's deciding what the conversation is actually about. It's deciding what the person needs to hear. It's deciding what you're willing to stand behind. And that decision takes practice. At first, saying less feels uncomfortable. You might worry you sound cold. You might worry you sound too direct. You might worry people will misunderstand you without the extra context. But over time, you learn something surprising. Clarity reduces misunderstanding, it doesn't increase it. Because most misunderstandings don't come from too little information. They come from too much. Too many angles. Too many mixed messages. Too many half-statements. The cleaner your message is, the less room there is to twist it. It doesn't invite unnecessary debate because it doesn't offer unnecessary openings. It doesn't give the other person 10 small points to argue about. It gives them one clear truth to respond to. And that changes the quality of your conversations. Your relationships become clearer. Your boundaries become clearer. Your leadership becomes clearer. Your requests become clearer. Even your confidence becomes clearer, because you stop hiding behind words and start trusting your intention. You start speaking like you mean it. Not louder. Not harsher. Just cleaner. And once you feel that power, once you feel what it's like to say something simple and watch it land, you stop craving noise. You start craving precision. Because precision is respect. Precision is strength. Precision is care. The human brain remembers clarity, not clutter. So if you want to be heard, don't try to say everything. Say what matters. And let the rest go. People are drawn to mystery. You don't realize how true that is until you notice the moments when attention slips away. The moments when you're talking, explaining, filling every gap with words, and something in the room quietly shifts. Eyes wander. Energy drops. The conversation starts to feel heavy instead of alive. You're still speaking, but people aren't really with you anymore. It's subtle, almost invisible. And because you care, because you want to be understood, you usually respond by saying more. You clarify. You add context. You explain your intention. You explain your explanation. You think the problem is that you haven't given enough information yet. That if you just say it better, cleaner, more completely, people will finally get it. But often the opposite is happening. When you say everything, there's nothing left to wonder about. When you explain too much, you remove curiosity. You don't give people space to lean in, so they lean back instead. You've been on the other side of this too. Listening to someone who answers every question before it's even asked. Someone who fills every pause, every silence, every breath with words. You don't think, wow, they're clear. You think, there's nothing for me to do here. No room to engage. No room to explore. No room to connect. Because curiosity needs space. You start noticing this pattern in everyday moments. In meetings. In friendships. In relationships. In those early conversations where first impressions quietly form. There's a difference between someone who talks at you and someone who leaves room for you. The second person feels magnetic even if they say less. They don't rush. They don't unload everything at once. They don't try to control how the conversation unfolds. They speak selectively. And because of that, people pay attention. They listen more closely. They think more deeply. They ask questions. Not because they're confused, but because they're curious. That's when it starts to click for you. Saying less doesn't mean being secretive. It doesn't mean being vague or withholding or playing games. It means being intentional. It means choosing what matters instead of dumping everything you know just because you can. It means trusting the conversation. For a long time, you didn't trust conversations. You felt responsible for carrying them. You felt like silence was a failure. Like if there was a pause, you had to fix it. Like if someone didn't immediately respond, it meant you'd said something wrong. So you filled the gaps. But silence isn't always awkward. Sometimes it's an invitation. You learn this the first time you stop yourself from over-explaining. You say what needs to be said clearly and simply, and then you stop. You don't rush to soften it. You don't stack disclaimers on top of it. You let it sit. Your heart beats a little faster than usual. This is where the old you would jump back in. But you don't. And something unexpected happens. The other person leans forward. Maybe not physically, but mentally. They ask a question. Or they pause to think. Or they respond more thoughtfully than you expected. The conversation deepens instead of stalling. That moment stays with you. You start noticing how much power there is in restraint. How confidence doesn't come from saying everything you know, but from knowing what not to say yet. You don't reveal everything at once. You let conversations unfold naturally. You allow others to engage instead of overwhelming them. That shift changes how people experience you. You become someone they want to hear more from, not less. Someone they're curious about, not someone they feel talked over by. Someone who leaves space for their thoughts to exist. And that space feels respectful. You realize that mystery isn't about hiding who you are. It's about pacing. About timing. About understanding that connection isn't built through information alone. It's built through interaction. When you tell someone everything up front, you turn a conversation into a presentation. When you speak selectively, you turn it into a shared experience. That's the difference. You see it in how people respond to questions. When you ask something thoughtful and then genuinely wait for the answer, the other person feels seen. They feel invited. They feel like their perspective matters. And when people feel that way, they open up. You start noticing how conversations feel lighter now. Less forced. Less exhausting. You're not working so hard to be interesting. You're letting interest arise naturally. You don't rush to prove your value. You don't feel the same urge to justify yourself. You trust that if someone wants to know more, they'll ask. And when they do, it feels better than any monologue ever could. This changes your relationships in quiet but meaningful ways. In friendships, you stop oversharing out of nervousness. You don't dump your entire story just to feel connected. You share pieces, honestly and intentionally, and you let the relationship build its own rhythm. In romantic connections, you stop trying to accelerate intimacy with information. You let moments breathe. You let curiosity grow. You let attraction develop through presence, not performance. In professional settings, you stop explaining every detail unless it's needed. You state your point clearly, then you pause. You let others engage. You notice how much more seriously you're taken when you're concise. Because clarity plus restraint feels confident. You're not afraid of silence anymore. You see it as part of the conversation, not a problem to solve. Silence gives people time to think. Silence gives ideas room to land. Silence gives emotion space to surface. And in that space, connection happens. You also notice something changing inside you. When you stop saying everything, you start listening more. Really listening. Not just waiting for your turn to speak, but paying attention to what's being said, and what isn't. You hear the pauses. You notice the hesitations. You sense the emotions underneath the words. You realize that communication isn't just about expressing yourself. It's about creating a space where both people feel involved. And mystery plays a role in that. Mystery keeps people engaged because it respects their intelligence. It doesn't spoon-feed. It doesn't overwhelm. It trusts that the other person can meet you halfway. That trust is felt. You felt it when someone speaks with intention. When they choose their words carefully. When they don't rush to fill every moment. When they allow the conversation to breathe. It makes you feel calm. Curious. Present. You want to stay. That's why engagement creates connection. Not constant talking. Not excessive explanation. Not emotional dumping. Engagement. The back and forth. The questions. The pauses. The unfolding. You begin to understand that connection isn't built by revealing everything as fast as possible. It's built by allowing discovery. And discovery requires mystery. Not the kind that confuses or manipulates, but the kind that invites. You don't hide who you are. You just don't force it all out at once. You trust timing. You trust curiosity. You trust that the right people will want to know more. And when they do, the connection feels mutual instead of one-sided. That changes how you experience conversations. They stop feeling like performances. They start feeling like exchanges. You're not trying to impress. You're not trying to convince. You're not trying to control how you're perceived. You're simply present. And presence is compelling. You think back to all the times you felt drained after talking. How heavy it felt to carry conversations alone. How exhausting it was to always be explaining, clarifying, justifying. Now, conversations give you energy instead of taking it. Because you're not doing all the work. You let others step in. You let them wonder. You let them ask. You let them engage. And that engagement creates connection. Real connection. The kind that doesn't feel rushed or forced. The kind that grows naturally because both people are involved in building it. People are drawn to mystery not because they want secrets, but because they want participation. They want to feel like part of something unfolding, not like passive listeners. When you understand that, the way you speak changes. The way you listen changes. The way you connect changes. You stop trying to say everything. And somehow you start being heard more. Pausing is one of the most underrated communication skills. It sounds almost too simple, like something that shouldn't matter. A pause? Just silence? How could that be powerful? But if you've ever said something too fast and regretted it 5 seconds later, you already know the answer. You already know how one rushed sentence can change the entire mood in a room. How one emotional reply can turn a small misunderstanding into a full argument. How one quick reaction can damage trust that took years to build. And the scary part is, it often happens so quickly. One comment, one tone, one look, and suddenly your body is reacting before your mind catches up. Your chest tightens. Your jaw clenches. Your thoughts speed up. You feel the urge to defend yourself. And then you speak. Not from clarity. From emotion. That's why pausing matters. Because when you pause, you regain control. You step back into the driver's seat. You stop letting your emotions steer the conversation. You create a gap between what you feel and what you say, and that gap is where your power lives. When you pause, you choose your words instead of reacting emotionally. This is the difference between a reaction and a response. A reaction is automatic. It's raw. It's your nervous system trying to protect you. Reaction is what happens when you feel attacked, embarrassed, ignored, misunderstood. It's the part of you that wants to win, defend, punish, prove. A response is intentional. It's measured. It comes from the version of you that wants to understand, connect, and solve, not explode. But you can't respond if you don't pause. Because response takes a second. Reaction happens in a flash. That's why pausing is so rare. And why it's so powerful. This matters most in tense moments. Not when everything is calm and easy. Anyone can communicate well when they're relaxed. The real test happens when emotions rise. When something hits a nerve. When someone says something that feels unfair. When you feel disrespected. When you feel like your side isn't being heard. Tense moments are where relationships either grow stronger or start breaking. And usually, the breaking doesn't happen because people hate each other. It happens because people speak too fast when they're hurting. When emotions are high, words spoken too fast often cause regret. You know this feeling. The moment you snap at someone and instantly wish you didn't. The moment you say, "Whatever, I don't care," when you actually care deeply. The moment you bring up something from the past just to win. The moment you speak in a tone that doesn't match your intention. And then the damage is done. Even if you apologize, the words still happened. The other person still felt them. The moment is still stored in memory. That's why pausing is not a small thing. It's protection. It protects your relationships from the worst version of your emotions. Because pausing gives you space to calm your nervous system and think clearly. This isn't just a mindset thing. It's physical. When you feel threatened, emotionally threatened, socially threatened, your body reacts like it's in danger. Your nervous system shifts into survival mode. You become more defensive, more reactive, more focused on protecting yourself than understanding the other person. In that state, you don't hear words properly. You hear threats. You don't interpret tone calmly. You interpret it as disrespect. And your brain starts building a case fast. They always do this. They never listen. They're trying to make me look bad. The other person starts responding not to understand but to protect themselves. They interrupt. They correct details. They focus on one word you used instead of the feeling behind it. They bring up their own list. And now both of you are talking but no one feels heard. This is how distance grows. Right in the middle of a conversation that was supposed to bring you closer. Too many words can feel like pressure. Like being flooded. Like there's no room to breathe or respond honestly. Even when the words are true, even when the feelings are valid, the volume alone can push the other person away. Not because they don't care, but because they don't know where to start. You can see it in their body language. Their eyes glaze slightly. Their posture shifts. They cross their arms. They stop asking questions. They go quiet, not the calm kind of quiet, but the shut down kind. And the more they shut down, the more the other person talks, trying desperately to pull them back in. It becomes a loop. One person talks more because they feel unheard. The other hears less because they feel overwhelmed. And both leave feeling disconnected. What often gets missed is that clarity doesn't come from saying everything. It comes from saying the right thing. Sometimes, one honest sentence carries more truth than 10 explanations ever could. I feel unheard. That sentence doesn't accuse. It doesn't analyze. It doesn't list evidence. It simply names a feeling. And feelings, when stated cleanly, are easier to receive. The other person doesn't have to defend against it. They don't have to remember details. They just have to sit with the reality that someone they care about feels unseen. I need some space. Not a threat. Not a rejection. Just a boundary. A recognition of emotional limits. That sentence can stop an argument from turning into damage. It gives both people room to breathe before words turn into weapons. This matters to me. Simple. Direct. Vulnerable. It doesn't demand agreement. It asks for care. These sentences don't overwhelm. They land. Saying less keeps conversations focused. It keeps them anchored in the present instead of drowning them in history. It reduces the chance of misinterpretation because there's less to misinterpret. There are fewer side paths to get lost in. Fewer emotional landmines waiting to be stepped on. And saying less requires maturity. It requires knowing what you're actually feeling instead of throwing every feeling into the conversation at once. It requires trusting that you don't need to convince the other person with volume. It requires restraint, which is often harder than expression. Because talking feels like control. Silence, or simplicity, feels like vulnerability. When you say one clear sentence and stop, you're exposed. There's nowhere to hide behind explanations. No buffer. Just the truth sitting in the open. And that can feel terrifying, especially if you've learned that being misunderstood is painful. So people talk more to protect themselves. But the protection backfires. Too many words blur emotional signals. They turn clarity into noise. They give the other person too many things to react to at once. And when people feel overwhelmed, they don't lean in, they pull back. People feel safer around those who don't overwhelm them with words. Safety in relationships isn't about constant reassurance or perfect communication. It's about emotional pacing. It's about knowing that conversations won't turn into interrogations. That one mistake won't turn into a character analysis. That one disagreement won't turn into a recap of every unresolved issue. When someone speaks simply and directly, it signals self-awareness. It says, I know what I feel. It says, I'm not here to attack you. It says, I'm here to be understood, not to win. That creates space. And space is what allows connection to return. Think about the people you feel calm around. The ones you can talk to without feeling drained afterward. Chances are, they don't talk in circles. They don't overwhelm you with words. They don't stack emotion on top of emotion until everything feels heavy. They say what they mean and they stop. That doesn't mean they're emotionally distant. It means they're emotionally grounded. In contrast, conversations that leave you exhausted often aren't intense because of the topic. They're intense because of the overload. Too many explanations. Too many assumptions. Too many unresolved feelings pouring out at once. You leave feeling like you need recovery time, not closeness. Relationships don't need more words. They need clearer ones. This becomes especially important during conflict. Conflict already raises emotions. It already narrows attention. The brain is already scanning for threat. Adding more words during that state doesn't create understanding. It creates confusion. That's why arguments escalate so quickly once the talking spirals. Someone brings up an issue. The other defends. The first adds more detail to be understood. The second feels accused and responds sharply. Now old mistakes enter. Now tone becomes the issue. Now intentions are questioned. And suddenly, no one remembers how it started. At that point, even good points get lost. Even valid feelings get buried under delivery. And both people walk away thinking, why can't we ever talk without it turning into this? The answer is often simpler than it feels. Too much is being said at the wrong time. Sometimes the most emotionally intelligent thing you can do is stop talking. Not to punish. Not to avoid. But to protect the connection. To let the moment cool. To choose timing over urgency. Because urgency is not always honesty. Urgency is often fear. Fear that if you don't say everything now, you'll never be heard. Fear that the moment will pass. Fear that your feelings won't matter later. But when urgency takes over, words lose precision. They spill instead of land. Learning to say less means learning to trust the relationship. Trust that one sentence can be enough. Trust that you can return to the conversation later. Trust that being clear matters more than being thorough. It also means learning to listen. When you speak less, you hear more. You notice shifts in tone. You catch what the other person is really reacting to. You create room for them to respond honestly instead of defensively. And that honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, is far more useful than a forced agreement. People don't need every detail of your emotional process in one conversation. They need to know what matters most right now. And often that can be said in one sentence. I'm hurt. I'm overwhelmed. I need reassurance. Those statements don't accuse. They invite. They allow the other person to meet you instead of brace against you. Saying less also prevents misunderstandings because fewer words leave less room for assumptions. Long explanations give people more chances to misinterpret tone, intention, or emphasis. A simple sentence is harder to twist because it's direct. It also models emotional regulation. It shows that you're aware of your state and choosing not to escalate. That matters more than being perfectly articulate. Emotional maturity isn't about how much you can express. It's about knowing what needs to be expressed. There's a quiet confidence in restraint. in knowing that you don't need to empty everything at once, that you can hold complexity without dumping it, that you can feel deeply and still speak simply. And people respond to that. They feel less attacked. They feel less pressured. They feel more willing to engage. Because conversations stop feeling like battles and start feeling like bridges. This doesn't mean silence is always the answer. Avoidance creates its own distance. But there's a difference between avoiding and choosing clarity. One hides. The other focuses. Choosing fewer words is choosing focus. It's choosing the heart of the issue instead of the edges. It's choosing connection over catharsis. It's choosing to be understood over being fully expressed in one moment. And that choice changes relationships. Because when conversations feel safe, people come back to them. They don't dread them. They don't shut down preemptively. They stay present. People feel safer around those who don't overwhelm them with words because safety lives in simplicity. It lives in knowing that communication won't turn into emotional overload. That you can speak and be heard without being buried. In the end, closeness isn't built through volume. It's built through precision. Through saying what matters and letting it breathe. Sometimes one honest sentence really is enough. And knowing that, truly trusting that, is what turns communication into connection instead of distance. In professional settings, saying less earns respect. It sounds almost backwards at first, especially if you grew up believing that the smartest person in the room is the one who talks the most. The one with the most opinions, the most explanations, the most polished answers. You might have spent years trying to prove yourself by being prepared, by speaking up, by filling every gap with something useful so no one could question whether you belong there. And for a while, that strategy works. You get noticed. People nod. Someone says, "Good point." You feel that small rush of relief, like you've earned your seat at the table for another day. But eventually you start seeing something that doesn't make sense until it does. The people who command the most respect aren't always the ones who speak the most. Sometimes it's the opposite. It's the person who speaks briefly, clearly, and then stops. The person who doesn't rush. The person who doesn't over-explain. The person whose words land like decisions instead of like requests for approval. At first it can feel unfair. You'll sit in meetings where the room is full of voices, full of ideas. People are talking in loops, repeating points with different phrasing, adding extra details to sound thorough. Someone is trying to win the discussion by sheer volume. Another person keeps interrupting to prove they're engaged. The air feels crowded with words. Then there's that one person. They're not quiet because they're unsure. They're quiet because they're listening. They're watching the room. They're tracking what matters. They're letting people reveal themselves through how they speak, what they emphasize, what they avoid. They're not rushing to impress anyone. And when they finally speak, the whole energy shifts. Not because they're louder. Because they're clearer. That's when you begin to understand. In professional settings, saying less isn't about being silent. It's about being intentional. Leaders who speak briefly and clearly are seen as confident. You can feel it immediately. Confidence has a rhythm. It doesn't scramble. It doesn't rush to defend itself. It doesn't spill out in endless justifications. A confident leader doesn't speak to fill space. They speak to move things forward. They don't dominate meetings. They guide them. That difference matters more than people realize. Dominating is loud. It's taking up airtime. It's making every point revolve around you. It's interrupting, correcting, circling back, reminding everyone that you're present. Guiding is different. Guiding means you create structure. You keep the conversation on track. You notice when people are drifting into irrelevant details and gently pull them back. You ask the questions that clarify. You summarize what's been said so the room can breathe. You connect the dots. You make sure the discussion has a direction. And in the middle of that, you don't need to talk much. You just need to talk well. Leaders who guide don't explain endlessly. They understand that over-explaining often signals uncertainty. Not always, but often enough to pay attention. When someone explains every detail before anyone asks, it can feel like they're trying to convince the room they're right, rather than trusting the point to stand on its own. Endless explanation also creates fatigue. It drains the room. It buries the important message under the weight of unnecessary words. It turns decisions into debates and turns simple direction into confusion. Leaders avoid that. They don't treat every moment like a performance. They respect people's time. They respect the meeting. They respect the energy in the room. And most importantly, they make decisions. This is where measured speech becomes powerful. In many workplaces, people confuse talking with leading. They confuse being involved with being effective. They think leadership is having something to say about everything. But leadership often looks like this. You listen. You gather input. You notice patterns. You ask a few precise questions. And then you choose. You say, here's what we're doing. Not harshly. Not arrogantly. Clearly. Because clarity is kindness in professional settings. Clear communication saves time. Time is the currency of every workplace, and people feel it when it's wasted. They feel it when meetings drag on without direction. They feel it when conversations repeat the same points over and over. They feel it when decisions keep getting postponed because no one wants to be the one to commit. So when someone speaks concisely, it's not just nice. It's valuable. It signals, I respect your time enough to be clear. It signals, I'm not here to hear myself talk. I'm here to solve something. Concise direction builds trust. Trust is fragile in professional environments because everyone is juggling pressure. Deadlines. Expectations. Performance. Reputation. When things feel uncertain, people look for stability. They look for someone whose words feel reliable. Concise direction does that. When someone says, this is our priority, and doesn't complicate it with 3 alternative priorities, people relax. When someone says, here's the next step, and doesn't drown it in 15 extra steps, people feel supported. When someone sets a clear boundary, people feel safer. Because clarity reduces anxiety. A confused team is not just unproductive, it's tense. People start guessing. They start filling in blanks. They start working on the wrong thing because no one wanted to be direct. Concise leaders prevent that. They simplify. They focus. And that focus becomes contagious. Measured speech shows authority. Authority isn't aggression. It's not talking down. It's not forcing compliance. Real authority is calm. It's someone who can speak without needing to prove they're important. Someone who doesn't need to explain every sentence because they trust their own judgment. Someone who can answer a question directly without turning it into a monologue. Measured speech also signals emotional control. In a meeting, anyone can speak when they're excited or defensive. Anyone can fill the room with words when they're nervous. But measured speech, the kind that stays calm under pressure, shows that you're not being driven by emotion. That's authority. It tells people, I can handle this. Even if the situation is messy. Even if the numbers are bad. Even if the client is upset. Even if the timeline is tight. When a leader speaks with measured calm, it steadies everyone else. That steadiness is power. When you speak less, people listen more. Because your words aren't competing with themselves. If you talk constantly, people learn that your voice is just background noise. They stop paying attention to the beginning because they know it will go on too long. They wait for the summary that never comes. They nod politely while their mind drifts to emails, tasks, and time. But when you speak less, when you don't waste words, people lean in. They notice when you start talking. They assume it matters. Because you've trained them through your behavior. You don't speak unless there's a reason. And that's a powerful reputation to earn. It's not about being mysterious. It's about being intentional. Your words carry weight because they're not wasted. Weight doesn't come from complex vocabulary or long explanations. It comes from precision. From restraint. From knowing what matters and letting everything else go. You start to notice that the most respected voices in a room are often the simplest ones. They don't decorate the message. They deliver it. They say, here's the issue. Here's what we know. Here's what we need. Here's the decision. And then they pause. They allow the room to process. They don't chase approval through extra words. They don't keep adding clarifications because they're afraid someone might disagree. They trust that if someone needs more information, they can ask. That kind of trust changes how people respond to you. Because it signals confidence but also respect. It says, I believe you're capable of understanding. It says, I'm not going to overwhelm you to prove my value. It says, I'm here to lead, not to perform. And here's what's interesting. Saying less doesn't make you invisible. It makes you memorable. Because in a world of constant noise, the person who speaks with clarity becomes a signal. People remember your sentences because they weren't buried under 20 others. They remember your direction because it wasn't confusing. They remember your presence because it wasn't scattered. They trust you more because you didn't waste their time. This is where a lot of people struggle at first. Because speaking less feels risky when you're trying to prove yourself. You feel like you need to show effort out loud. You feel like silence might be interpreted as weakness. You worry that if you don't contribute constantly, people will assume you're not valuable. So you fill the space. You offer extra thoughts, extra context, extra supporting points. But over time you start learning something real. Value isn't measured by word count. It's measured by impact. One clear sentence that moves the room forward is more valuable than 10 minutes of scattered explanation that leaves everyone confused. One decisive direction is more valuable than endless discussion that delays action. One well-timed question that brings clarity is more valuable than 5 opinions that add noise. So you start practicing restraint. You listen more than you speak. You wait until you have something real to add. You choose simple words. You make your point, then stop. And the first few times you do that, it feels uncomfortable. You'll feel the silence after you speak, and your instinct will be to fill it, to soften it, to add just, and maybe, and I think, and if that makes sense. But you resist. You breathe. You let the words land. You trust your message. And slowly you begin to notice what happens. People respond differently. They take you more seriously. They ask for your opinion more deliberately. They remember what you said. They follow your direction. Not because you became louder. Because you became clearer. That's the quiet shift that changes your professional presence. You stop talking to be seen. You start speaking to lead. And when you do, something surprising happens. You don't lose respect. You gain it. Because in professional settings, the person who can speak briefly, clearly, and with intention is the person who looks like they know where they're going. And people respect that. They trust that. They follow that. Because words are powerful, but only when you don't waste them. The power of saying less is not about being quiet all the time. It's not about turning yourself into someone who never speaks up, never shares, never takes up space. It's not about shrinking. It's not about disappearing. It's about being intentional with your voice. It's about knowing the difference between words that matter and words that are just trying to fill silence. It's about understanding that your voice has weight, and if you use it constantly, it starts to feel lighter. Most people don't talk because they have something important to say. They talk because they feel uncomfortable. Because quiet makes them nervous. Because they want to be liked. Because they want to prove they belong. Because they're afraid that if they stop talking, someone will forget they're there. So they keep adding words like they're stacking bricks, hoping it builds something solid. But too often it doesn't. It builds noise. And noise has a strange effect. It makes you feel busy but not powerful. It makes you feel involved but not respected. It makes you feel present but not remembered. You've probably felt it in your own life. The times you walked away from a conversation thinking, why did I say all that? Why did I keep going? Why did I explain myself into a corner? You weren't even lying, but you were over-talking. Trying to be understood so badly that your message got diluted. Trying to make it safe so much that the truth got buried. Sometimes it happens when you're nervous. You start talking fast. You add little extra phrases, like, basically, and suddenly you're 5 sentences deep and you've lost your own point. You can feel the other person drifting, not because they don't care, but because the message is wandering. It doesn't have a center. Sometimes it happens when you feel challenged. Someone questions you, and before you even breathe, you start defending. You pull out details. You explain every step. You offer your reasoning, your intentions, your context, your history. You're trying to protect yourself. You're trying to make sure they don't misunderstand you. But the more you talk, the more it sounds like you're unsure. Like you're negotiating your own truth. And that's the painful part. The words you add to feel safe often make you sound less confident. That's why saying less isn't silence. It's strength. It's you deciding that every time you speak, it's going to mean something. Speak when it matters. That sounds simple, but it's actually a skill. Because the world trains you to react to everything. Someone makes a comment, you respond. Someone interrupts, you jump back in. Someone questions you, you defend. Someone disagrees, you argue. Social media does it too. Constant opinions, constant takes, constant commentary, like if you don't say something, you don't exist. So learning to speak when it matters means resisting that impulse. It means letting some things pass. It means not treating every moment like a moment you have to win. It means you start asking yourself quietly before you speak, is this necessary? Is this helpful? Is this true? Because sometimes the strongest thing you can do is not respond immediately. Not because you're weak, but because you're grounded. Because you're not controlled by the moment. Pause when it doesn't. Pausing is underrated. Pausing feels awkward to people who are addicted to filling space. But pausing is where your power shows. A pause tells the room you're thinking. A pause tells the other person you're not rushing. A pause tells everyone that you're not desperate for control. And when you pause, you create space for clarity. You create space for the other person to finish. You create space for emotion to settle. You create space for your own thoughts to come together instead of coming out scrambled. It's funny how much respect a pause can command. Because most people talk over their own uncertainty. They talk to outrun discomfort. They talk so they don't have to sit with the feeling of not knowing what to say. But when you can sit with that feeling, when you can breathe through it, you become someone who feels steady. You become someone who doesn't need noise to feel strong. Choose clarity over noise. Clarity is not just shorter sentences. It's a mindset. It's the decision to speak with direction. It's the decision to have a point and not wander away from it. Clarity is you saying the most important thing first instead of burying it under explanations. Clarity is you cutting out the parts that are just there to protect your ego. Because a lot of noise is fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being judged. Fear of not sounding smart. Fear of being rejected. So people add words like armor. They over-explain, over-justify, over-defend. They try to make their message bulletproof, but all they really do is make it heavy. Clarity is lighter. Clarity is one clean sentence that lands. You don't need more words to be heard. You need better ones. This is the part most people don't want to accept. They assume being heard is about volume, about emphasis, about repeating themselves louder, longer, harder. But being heard is about impact. And impact comes from precision. Think of the people you remember. The ones whose words stay with you. They weren't always the loudest. They weren't always the most talkative. But when they spoke, it felt like something. Like their words had shape. Like they chose them. They didn't flood the room. They didn't ramble. They didn't chase reactions. They spoke with intention. And that intention is what made their voice stand out. When you learn to say less, your presence grows. This part feels almost backward, but it's true. When you talk less, people notice you more. Not because you're playing games, but because your energy changes. You stop reaching. You stop forcing. You stop trying to prove. You're not constantly interrupting the moment with your words. You're actually in the moment. You become more observant. You start listening more. You start reading people better. You start noticing what others miss because they're too busy talking. And people feel that presence. Presence is not about being loud. It's about being anchored. When you're present, your confidence shows. Not the loud, performative confidence that needs attention. The quiet confidence that doesn't chase approval. The kind of confidence that doesn't rush. Because a confident person doesn't need to say everything. They don't need to prove their intelligence with long explanations. They don't need to defend every detail. They don't need to respond to every comment. They're not terrified of being misunderstood. They trust their message enough to let it stand. They trust themselves enough to be quiet. And when you trust yourself, people can feel it. Your impact deepens. Because when you speak less, the words you do say become more meaningful. People take them more seriously. They listen differently. They remember them. It's like music. If a song is all noise all the time, nothing stands out. It's exhausting. Your brain can't hold it. It becomes background. But when there are pauses, when there's space, every note hits harder. Every lyric lands deeper. Your communication works the same way. If you speak constantly, your words blend together. People stop tracking. They stop absorbing. They stop feeling. But when you choose your moments, your words land. They land because they're not competing with unnecessary extras. They land because you're not asking the listener to sort through clutter to find the point. They land because you said what mattered. Because in a world full of noise, the calm voice stands out. That's not just a nice line. It's real. Everyone is trying to be louder. Everyone is trying to be seen. Everyone is competing for attention. Everyone is talking, posting, reacting, arguing, explaining. Noise is everywhere. So when someone speaks calmly, when someone speaks with restraint, with clarity, with intention, it feels different. It cuts through. It makes people lean in. It makes people listen. Calm doesn't mean weak. Calm means controlled. Calm means you're not dragged around by emotion. Calm means you're not trying to dominate the room. Calm means you're stable enough to choose your words carefully. And stability is magnetic. People trust stable energy. People feel safe around stable energy. People pay attention to stable energy because it doesn't demand attention. It earns it. And the person who speaks with intention is the one people remember. Not because they spoke the most, but because they spoke the clearest. They spoke the truest. They spoke at the right time. They spoke with meaning. They didn't waste words. They didn't throw sentences into the air just to feel involved. They didn't argue for sport. They didn't talk to fill their own discomfort. They used their voice like it mattered. And that's what makes you memorable. Not the amount you say. The intention behind what you choose to say and what you choose not to. So the power of saying less isn't silence. It's maturity. It's restraint. It's the discipline to pause when the moment doesn't need your voice and to speak when it does. It's the decision to choose clarity over noise. Because you don't need more words to be heard. You need better ones. And when you learn to say less, your presence grows. Your confidence shows. Your impact deepens. In a world full of noise, the calm voice stands out. And the person who speaks with intention is the one people remember. The power of saying less is not about being quiet all the time. It's about being intentional with your voice. Because there's a difference between silence that comes from fear and silence that comes from control. One makes you disappear. The other makes you undeniable. For a long time, you didn't know which one you were practicing. You just knew you were tired. Tired of talking and still not being understood. Tired of explaining yourself until your throat felt dry, only to watch people nod politely and forget what you said 5 minutes later. Tired of feeling like you had to earn attention by being louder, faster, more entertaining, more convincing. And if you're honest, there were times you spoke too much because you were nervous. Times you filled the air because silence felt dangerous. Times you kept adding words because you were trying to protect yourself from being judged. Like you could soften the impact by padding it with extra context. You'd start a sentence and immediately start adjusting it. Clarifying before anyone even asked. Apologizing before anyone criticized. Laughing to make it lighter even when what you were saying mattered to you. And afterward, you'd leave the conversation feeling drained, wondering why you always did that. Wondering why you couldn't just say what you meant and stop. But then you had moments on the other side, moments where you said nothing at all. Not because you didn't have thoughts, but because your thoughts felt too risky, too heavy, too likely to create conflict. You stayed quiet and watched opportunities pass. You watched misunderstandings grow. You watched people assume things about you because you never corrected them. That kind of quiet didn't feel peaceful. It felt like swallowing yourself. So you bounced between two extremes, over-explaining to be safe or staying silent to avoid trouble. And neither one felt like freedom. Freedom came when you started learning a third option. Intentional voice. Speak when it matters. Pause when it doesn't. Choose clarity over noise. At first, it sounds like a nice idea, something you'd hear and nod at, but not something that changes how you live. Because you don't realize how automatic your habits are until you try to change them. The first time you decide to speak with intention, you feel it in your body. You feel the urge to fill the space. You feel your mind racing to cover every angle. You feel your heart pushing your words forward like it's afraid of being interrupted. You're in a conversation, maybe at work, maybe with someone close, and you're about to jump into your usual rhythm. Rapid explanations, extra details, little disclaimers at the end of every sentence. But something in you pauses. Not out of fear. Out of awareness. You ask yourself, what do I actually need to say right now? That question feels simple, but it's powerful because it forces you to separate what matters from what's just noise. You realize you've been carrying so much unnecessary language. Words used to defend yourself before you're attacked. Words used to sound smarter than you feel. Words used to prevent misunderstanding by trying to control how you're perceived. And that's exhausting. So you try something different. You say one sentence. A clean one. And you stop. The silence after it feels louder than your words. You feel that familiar panic rise. Say more. Fix it. Explain it better. Make sure they get it. Make sure they don't misunderstand. Make sure you don't look foolish. But you don't move. You breathe. You let your words stand on their own. And you watch what happens. People listen differently when you don't flood them. They have room to process. Room to respond. Room to engage. It's almost like the conversation finally becomes a conversation instead of a performance. You notice their face. You notice their eyes actually focusing. You notice a slight pause on their end too, as if your silence gave them permission to slow down. And you realize something you hadn't fully understood before. You don't need more words to be heard. You need better ones. Not perfect words. Not poetic words. Better words, clearer, more honest, more direct. Words that don't hide behind noise. Because sometimes the reason people don't hear us isn't that we're not talking enough. It's that we're talking around what we mean. We're burying the real message under layers of explanation because we're afraid of how it will land. Clarity takes courage. It takes courage to say, I don't agree, without adding 10 softeners. It takes courage to say, I need time, without over-justifying it. It takes courage to say, that hurt me, without turning it into blame or drama. It takes courage to say, this is what I want, and let that be enough. And when you start practicing that courage, something shifts inside you. When you learn to say less, your presence grows. Because presence isn't created by constant talking. Presence is created by groundedness. By the feeling that you're not scrambling for approval. By the calm that comes from knowing your words are chosen, not spilled. People can feel when you're speaking from intention. It has a different weight. A different rhythm. Your confidence shows. Not the loud kind. Not the performative kind. The real kind. The kind that comes from not needing to fill every silence to prove you belong in the room. The kind that comes from trusting your voice enough to let it be simple. And your impact deepens. Because impact isn't about volume. It's about precision. Think about the people you remember. The ones who left an impression on you. They weren't always the ones who talked the most. Often they were the ones who spoke at the right moment. They listened. They observed. They waited. And then when they spoke, it landed. It landed because it was intentional. You start seeing this in your own life. You start noticing that when you speak less, you're not losing influence, you're gaining it. You're not giving away your power in unnecessary explanations. You're not draining the room with words that don't need to be said. You're not fighting for attention. You're earning it by being clear. And in a world full of noise, the calm voice stands out. That's not just a nice sentence. It's real. The world is loud. Notifications, opinions, constant commentary, people talking just to be heard. Everyone is competing for attention, and most of it is frantic. Most of it is reactive. So when someone speaks calmly, clearly, and with intention, it creates contrast. It creates a pause in the noise. People notice. Not because you're trying to be mysterious or impressive, but because your energy isn't scattered. It's focused. The calm voice stands out because it doesn't beg to be heard. It simply is. And there's something about that feels safe. Trustworthy. Solid. People trust what feels solid. They lean toward it. You notice it in group settings. There's always the person filling the air, trying to steer the conversation by sheer volume. And then there's the person who waits. The person who listens and then speaks once, cleanly. The room shifts for that person. Even if it's subtle. Because their words feel deliberate. Deliberate words carry authority. That doesn't mean you become cold or distant. Intentional communication isn't about shutting people out. It's about inviting people in but not overwhelming them. It's about giving conversations room to unfold naturally. Letting others participate. Letting curiosity live. It's about speaking when it matters. You start noticing how often you used to speak when it didn't matter. How many words you used to spend on proving yourself. On defending yourself. On trying to manage how people perceived you. And you begin to let that go. You stop explaining things to people who aren't trying to understand. You stop arguing with people who only want to win. You stop pouring your energy into conversations that don't deserve it. You learn that your voice is valuable. Your attention is valuable. Your words are a resource. So you choose where to spend them. Pause when it doesn't. This becomes a new kind of strength for you. Because pausing isn't passive. Pausing is control. It's the ability to sit with silence without rushing to fill it. It's the ability to let someone else talk without interrupting. It's the ability to not react instantly to something that triggers you. Pausing gives you time to choose your response instead of being dragged by your emotions. And the more you practice pausing, the more you notice your life changing in small, meaningful ways. Arguments don't escalate as quickly. Misunderstandings get resolved faster. People respect your boundaries more. You respect yourself more. Because you're not constantly in performance mode. You're present. That presence becomes part of your identity. People start to describe you differently. Not necessarily to your face, but you can feel it. They trust you with serious conversations. They ask for your opinion and actually wait for it. They listen when you speak because they know you don't waste words. And even when you're not speaking, you're still felt. That might be one of the biggest shifts of all. Learning that presence isn't only created through sound. It can be created through stillness. You don't have to fight for space anymore. You simply take it, calmly, confidently, without urgency. Because you're not trying to dominate. You're trying to connect. And connection isn't built through constant talking. It's built through intention. Through attention. Through choosing words that reflect what you actually mean, and then allowing the other person to meet you there. The person who speaks with intention is the one people remember. Not because they were the loudest. Because they were clear. Because they were calm. Because their words had weight. And the best part is, you don't have to become someone else to do this. You don't have to change your personality. You don't have to become quieter in a way that erases you. You simply become more deliberate. You learn to trust that what you have to say is valuable enough to be simple. You learn that you don't need to flood the room to be noticed. You learn that silence is not your enemy. It's your ally. And slowly you stop fearing the space after your words. You start using it. You let your sentences land. You let your presence speak. You let people come toward you instead of chasing them with noise. Because in a world full of noise, the calm voice stands out. And once you become that calm voice, you realize something quietly powerful. You were never meant to be heard because you spoke more. You were meant to be heard because you spoke with intention.